Matter, let the record show the presence of counsel and the defendant. Sype is now back on the witness stand, sir. I will remind you that you are still under oath. For the record, I have now viewed Exhibit 2, and Mr. Merritt, you may proceed with your cross-examination.
Thank you, Your Honor. I would move for the admission of Exhibit 11, the photograph of the two rifles found in Mr. Shaver's room.
No, Judge. No, Judge, thank you.
Exhibit 11 is admitted.
I do have in your binder in front of you, I believe, the departmental reports.
Yes, most of them.
I'd ask you this morning about the individuals who possibly saw the pointing of this rifle out the window as a possible threat or an alarm. So could you find in your volume there the supplemental of J. Amundsen, A-M-U-N-D-S-E-N?
Okay, sir.
And Officer Amundsen interviewed Vincent and Linda Surratt, right?
That's correct.
And they were two people who were staying at the La Quinta, correct?
That's correct.
They were out there at the pool when Mr. Shaver was pointing this rifle that we can see in Exhibit 11 out his window on this evening in January 18th, right?
That's correct.
And Officer Edmondson talked to them, right?
Yes.
And if we look at page 3 of his report, they say they saw two subjects that had a gun with a scope, right?
Yes.
And Vincent was so alarmed that he told his wife to get her belongings, that they were going to immediately leave the spa area, right?
That's correct.
And we go down a little further, and it seemed to Linda and Vincent that the two subjects with the rifle were looking for potential targets, right?
Yes.
But that's what the people in the hotel thought the people in room 502 were doing with this rifle.
Yes.
And they went, Vincent and Linda Surratt went to the front desk and asked the front desk, told the front desk what they had seen, right?
Yes.
And the front desk called the Mesa Police, right?
Yes.
And that was a 911 emergency call, right?
Yes.
And that's what you put in your report. This is an emergency call.
Yes.
All right. Now, how long at the time that Officer Brailsford responded to this call on the evening of January 18th had he been an officer with the Mesa Police?
I believe it was something like 2 years. I put the exact number
Approximately.
in the report, but I believe it was approximately 2 years.
Okay. And he responded to this call with an AR-15.
Yes.
And as you indicated, he was one of the two officers that were designated by Sergeant Langley as lethal force.
Yes.
That was the sergeant's call. That wasn't Officer Brailsford's call, right?
That's correct.
Okay. You didn't interview Officer Doan, did you?
No, I did not.
You didn't interview Officer Elmore, did you?
No, I did not.
And you didn't interview Officer Gomez, did you?
No, I did not.
You didn't interview Officer Cochran, did you?
No, I did not.
You didn't interview Sergeant Langley, did you?
No, I did not.
Sergeant Langley has been, or had been, I think he's retired now, isn't he?
I believe so, yes.
But at the time of this incident, when he responded with his team, with his men, he'd been an officer and a law enforcement officer for over 30 years, right?
I believe he worked for the city of Mesa for 22. I don't know what he did before that.
You don't know the qualifications of Sergeant Langley when he was responding to this call and what he did at this call? You're unaware of his qualifications?
I know he was a sergeant for 22 years. Or not a sergeant, but he was employed as a police officer with the city of Mesa for 22 years approximately.
Okay. So at least he had as many years on the force as you did.
Yes.
And he may have had more time before that. You're just unaware of it.
Yes.
All right. You said that when you were talking about the sergeant's instructions, or what the sergeant had these two individuals do at the motel, that protocol was nothing like you'd ever been trained or observed. Right? I wrote that down. That's what you said.
Yes.
You've not been trained like that.
I have not, no.
You were not trained by Officer Jeff Jacobs, were you?
Well, it's been a long time since I started, so as far as training, he has instructed me at firearms at times. He may have taught in the academy, but that was obviously a long time ago too, but I don't recall specifically taking any class from him.
Right. He's one of my witnesses, and I asked him if he trained you. He said he didn't, so.
I would believe that.
Officer Brailsford was trained by Jeff Jacobs. You aware of that?
I was not, no.
All right. Concerning this protocol you talked about that you weren't trained in, do you know who trained Sergeant Langley?
I do not.
Well, when you were here telling the judge about the protocol that you're critical of, you didn't ask him who trained him, where he learned that then, did you?
I didn't ask.
Sergeant Langley, where he learned to do this, that you're telling the judge was not proper.
I don't believe I said it wasn't proper. I said it was something I was never trained to do.
You said it wasn't proper protocol, Detective.
It wasn't a proper protocol that I'd ever seen or that I was trained.
This having the people come toward the officers, the suspects come toward the officers, that's what we're talking about, right?
You can do that in a number of different fashions, and I was obviously...
I'm not asking you about something else. I'm asking you about these suspects coming toward these officers, right? That's what we're talking about this afternoon.
If we're talking specifically about that.
Yes. Now, at the other end of the hall is room 502.
Yes.
The door faces which way?
The door would kind of face northeast.
You're right, it kind of does face that way. It's kind of at an oblique angle, right?
Yes.
The hallway faces like I'm facing the judge, right?
Yes.
And the door kind of faces like my hand is, right?
Yes.
So as I'm standing back here where the officers are, The officers can't see the front of the door.
That's correct.
Now, we know that at least one and maybe two suspects are in that room pointing a rifle out of that window, right?
Yes.
We don't know how many other suspects are in that room. We don't know how many guns are in that room, do we?
Correct.
And so we can't see the door of that room.
That's correct.
And you're suggesting, or you suggested to my colleague, that those officers ought to go up to that door they can't see. To suspects that might be in that room with rifles that we know are in that room because they don't see the rifles in those suspects' hands. That's what you're suggesting?
I'm suggesting that that's one option.
Okay. That's one of the options the officers could have taken.
Correct.
Okay. But that's not the option that Sergeant Langley took, right?
Correct.
And in any event, that was not this young man's option because he wasn't in charge.
Correct.
Okay. And Sergeant Langley isn't here today for probable cause, is he?
I believe he's outside, but he's not here now.
But he's not here today for probable cause.
I don't understand the question.
I'll withdraw it. Now, my colleague asked you, when you watched the video, if you ever heard anyone ask Mr. Shaver to empty his pockets, and you said no. And if you ever heard anyone asked if he had a weapon, or if they asked the young lady if she had a weapon, and you said no, you never heard anybody ask them. And I gathered from that question, or those questions, that you and she thought that might have been a good idea. Is that correct?
That's not correct, no.
Okay, well, do you think that would have been a good idea for the officers to ask that?
I think it's a good idea to ask if they have any weapons. I would not ask someone to empty their pockets in that situation, no.
Why wouldn't you?
Because if they were
I never ask why questions, but I just did. Go ahead.
If they were armed, they would be reaching for a weapon. In that situation where you already know that you're going to at least detain them in handcuffs, it's better to keep them where you can see their hands and bring them back to you where you can then check their pockets yourself.
Because the last place you want a suspect who's come out of a room where there are guns is to ask him to put his hands or her hands in her pockets, right?
That's correct.
That's the last place, right?
Yes.
And probably the next place is you don't want them to put their hands behind their back, do you?
No.
Well, okay. And asking them that if they have any weapons is pretty much a useless question too, isn't it?
I don't think it's a useless question, but you obviously have to be cognizant of the fact that they might not tell the truth.
But even if you ask them, are you going to believe them?
No.
Because, for example, in this particular case, the officer, Sergeant Langley, asked Mr. Shaver if he was drunk. He said no, right?
That's correct.
But it turned out he was a .29 from the toxicology report, right?
That's correct.
And that is extremely drunk, right?
Yes.
So we know that Mr. Shaver lied to the officers.
Yes.
And that's common, isn't it?
Yes.
So asking the suspects, as Ms. Tarbell suggested, if they had any weapons is really not very fruitful for police officers.
I think it could be fruitful or it could not.
Okay. I'm sorry. Please finish your answer.
It would be a question that you would sometimes ask, and sometimes you get a truthful answer, and sometimes you don't.
Okay. But in any event, concerning your answers to us today, to the judge today, and your impressions of what you saw about whether this was a threat or whether this wasn't, or whether this was proper, you have given us your impressions based upon your training, correct?
Yes.
And so it would be fair to say that what Mr. Brailsford did and what the other officers did, it would be important to know how they were trained, correct?
Yes.
Now, you gave us some answers this morning concerning what the officers said in their reports, or at least kind of paraphrase what they had said in their reports.
Yes.
But you have their reports and you can tell us exactly what they said, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So let's do that.
Actually, I believe they marked their reports.
Oh, sure.
I have, those copies are not with me.
I understand. Can you approach, Your Honor?
You may.
Let me give you reports just marked. They may not be all of them. If they're not all there, then the other ones would be in your binder, probably, sir?
Yes, I believe these are all the ones that I provided this morning to be marked, so I should have all of them.
Okay. One of them is yours, so let's skip that one. What's the first one you have, and tell us the exhibit number.
Exhibit number 4, Officer Gomez's report.
All right, let me find my corresponding file, and we'll look at that one first. And that's exhibit what, sir?
4.
Now, Officer Gomez is the officer who ended up cuffing Miss Portillo, correct?
Yes.
So at some point his observations may have been distracted a little bit.
Yes.
Okay. If you look down at the bottom, he notes that Sergeant Langley started giving the male commands, and he states that the male was failing to follow the commands given, correct?
Yes.
And then on the next page, he again notes that the male again failed to follow the directions he was given.
Yes.
And then that the male was yelled at, presumably by Sergeant Langley, to follow directions, and that he reached his hand towards his back, and that the next thing he heard were shots fired.
Yes.
Correct? So that's exactly what Officer Gomez put in his report, right?
Yes.
All right, what's the next report you have?
It's exhibit number 5, and it's Officer Cochran's report.
Okay, his report references a subject with a gun. And on the second page, he indicates that Daniel made a few furtive movements, causing Sergeant Langley to more adamantly repeat his verbal instructions, right?
Yes.
And then he indicates that Daniel was told if he didn't follow his directions and made sudden movements, it would be perceived as a threat.
Yes.
But then he was behind the officers as Daniel began to crawl, correct?
Yes.
And that's about the end of his report concerning any other comments, correct?
Yes.
The next one?
The next one is exhibit number 6, and it's Officer Jones' report.
Okay, and Doan has, I have no notes on Doan, so we can move that. I have Officer Doan, he can tell us. I don't need his. What's next?
The next one is Exhibit number 7, Officer Elmore.
And that's Exhibit 7?
Yes.
Now, Officer Elmore says, on the second page, while Daniel was in the kneeling position, he inexplicably brought both of his hands down from above his head and placed them behind his back where they could not be seen. Now, Officer Elmore is the other officer with the AR-15 as Officer Brailsford had, correct?
Correct.
And Brailsford was on the right side of the hallway, and Elmore was on the left side.
That's correct.
And this kind of, again, set the scene. Doan is in between them.
Doan would be more behind Officer Elmore.
Okay, but Doan has the other acts on video,
Correct.
and you can see Elmore with Doan's video.
Correct.
And the judge has just seen Doan's video.
Correct.
And so the judge has just seen at the instant that Shaver goes like this, the judge has just seen Officer Elmore with his AR-15 go just like this, hasn't he?
Yes.
Okay. Now, let's go back to his report. So Elmore says, put him behind his back where they could not be seen. This is at first,
Correct.
right?
Yes.
And Officer Elmore says, perceiving a threat, this is the first time, I brought my rifle up from the ready position to aim it at Daniel.
Yes.
Correct, sir?
Yes.
Sergeant Langley forcefully yelled at Daniel to keep his hands where we could see them, and Daniel again brought his hands up.
Yes.
Sergeant Langley forcefully yelled at Daniel to keep his hands where we could see them, and Daniel again brought his hands up. Sergeant Langley told Daniel if he didn't follow instructions exactly, it would be perceived as a threat. Daniel was then ordered to crawl forward towards us. Daniel quickly brought his right hand down towards his right pocket and waistband. I perceived a threat. Correct? And I believed he was possibly reaching for a weapon, so I brought my rifle up from the ready position to the aiming position at Daniel while attempting to maintain a visual on his right hand. Correct?
That's correct.
That's what Officer Elmore's report says.
Yes.
And if you watch Doan's acts on video, you can see him lunge forward just like that with his weapon, correct?
Yes.
And his report then says, I heard Officer Brailsford discharge his weapon approximately 5 times and Daniel fell forward. Correct?
Yes.
All right. And that's it for what you have there.
I have Sergeant Langley's Exhibit number 8.
Oh, you have Langley?
Yes.
Oh, good. I'm sorry. I didn't think you had it. Good. Exhibit 8?
Yes.
All right. Now, to start with, we note in like the third or so paragraph, he positioned himself behind Officer Brailsford, correct?
It's the third paragraph?
Well, 1, 2, 3, 4th, I'm sorry, or maybe 5th.
Some of them are kind of run together, but
Yes, sir.
That was roughly my understanding of where his position.
No, well, no, take your time. It starts out, at this time I laid out assignments for calling out.
I just found it, sir. Yes.
I positioned myself behind Officer Brailsford because at the time Officer Brailsford fired, Sergeant Langley was behind him, correct?
I don't know exactly his position.
I'm sorry.
No, he was roughly somewhere behind him and fairly close.
You didn't interview him, right. Okay. So, and then it says Officer Elsmore was assigned lethal coverage. Okay. In the next page. On the second paragraph, he states, the male was instructed to crawl forwards towards us with his hands in the air. As the male came close to us, I saw him abruptly drop his right hand from above his head and reach back to the small of his back. I immediately perceived this as a threat and a movement to reach a handgun. Correct?
Yes.
Officer Brailsford engaged the suspect with his service rifle with multiple shots, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so now we have all of the officers' reports that were there telling us what they perceived.
Correct.
Just a minute. Now, are you familiar with the term contact cover, that principle?
Yes.
That's a common term with police officers.
Yes, it is.
And so in this particular case, if we were to use that term, Sergeant Langley would be the contact officer and the other officers would have been the cover officers.
Yes.
And that means that the contact officer is the one that's going to be the speaking officer.
That's correct.
And if you view the video, it's pretty clear that that was Sergeant Langley because at times he speaks very loudly.
Yes.
And the other officers are the cover officers.
That's correct.
And that was the duty of Officer Brailsford.
Yes.
And the duty of cover officers is to provide cover. One of the duties of a cover officer is to provide cover for the team.
That's correct.
In other words, he's there to protect himself and the other officers.
Yes.
And he's also there to protect the public.
Yes.
In this particular case, they were there with the known information that there was a suspect in room 502 with a rifle.
Yes.
It turns out later that it is an air rifle, and people may think that that may be innocuous, but whether it is or it isn't, they don't know that, correct?
That's correct.
All they know is a suspect in a room with a rifle.
Yes.
And officers generally think where there's one gun, there are other guns, right?
Yes.
And where there's a rifle, there are probably handguns, right?
Yes.
That's what you are taught.
That's correct.
And if you don't think that way, you end up sorry, right?
Yes.
So there are people in this hotel, motel, whatever it is. So Officer Brailsford and the other cover officers are not only there to protect the team, the other officers, but to protect the other people in the motel, correct?
Yes.
That's part of his duty, correct?
Yes.
And when the young lady is taken into custody and handcuffed, she's there with the other officers, correct?
That's correct.
And part of the cover officer's duty is to protect her as well, correct?
Yes.
And that's part of Officer Brailsford's duty as well.
Yes.
So, in essence, the duty to provide cover is to remain alert, and in his case, with his weapon, is the duty to use deadly force in the event it becomes necessary. Fair statement?
Yes.
Now, in this particular case, would it be fair to say that this was a high threat situation?
I would say so, yes.
So when the officers came up and were out of the elevator on the 5th floor, they were perceiving themselves in a high threat situation. Fair statement?
I would assume so, yes.
Now, room 502 is at the west end of the motel?
It's at the east end. They came off the west elevator.
East end. Okay. I was out there. I got myself turned around. Okay. So it's at the east end. So the motel runs east and west?
Roughly.
Okay. And the room 502 is at the east end by one of the elevators?
Yes.
Okay. And the officers, Sergeant Langley tactically decided to go up the elevator at the west end, the other end, correct?
That's correct.
Because he didn't want to have the elevator's door open at at where room 502 was.
Correct.
And so the officers got with Sergeant Langley in the elevator and came up the other end. Now, how wide is the hallway? It's not very wide. What, 5.5 feet max?
I would say that's approximately, yes.
Okay. So I'm about 5.5 feet, maybe just a little more. So the hallway that these officers were in, and there were how many? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
6, yes.
6 of them. 6 police officers, 2 with AR-15s, in a 5.5 foot hallway, right?
Yes.
And that means there was nothing but people, wall to wall.
That would be an assessment.
And at the end, there was nothing but people and a female.
After they came out, the 2 people were in the hall there. I guess I don't understand the question.
Yes, sir. After the female had been taken into custody, and as they were trying to get Mr. Shaver down the hallway, taken into custody, there was nothing but officers and a female in this hallway.
Yes.
And unknown people in the rooms.
Correct.
So if someone like Mr. Schaefer had had a weapon and had produced one when his arm was coming forward, it would have been impossible for him to have missed anybody. Correct?
I would say there was a good probability he would hit someone.
Yeah. I mean, there was just nothing but people in front of him.
Correct.
Okay. So the 2 people come out of the room very quickly.
Yes.
One after the other.
Yes.
And you're unaware of what the instructions... Detective, do I have the transcript up there?
No, sir. It was here before lunch, but it's not here.
All right, let me find it. There it is. Thank you. That's fine. Here's Exhibit 10, which is hopefully... And see if you can turn to it and see if we can find out what instructions in Exhibit 10 are there.
And we're talking about the point where he has them go downstairs to get the key card. Is that the part I'm looking for?
Yes, sir. To make a telephone call, and we're trying to figure out what instructions were given.
Okay, sir. I found that page.
And just read it to us.
Male voice.
I'm sorry. Will you tell us the page number, please?
Oh, sorry. Page 9, sir.
Go ahead.
It says male voice inaudible. Can you call them from the front desk? male voice, and grab me a key card. Male voice, okay. Another male voice, can you guys call them from the front desk and give them instructions over the phone? Sergeant Langley, then, yeah, you're going to try that. Hey, Richard, could you go back with him and come back with the key card? Male voice, yeah, yup. Sergeant Langley, I'm going to send Rich with you to grab a key card and come back up, okay? Male voice, okay. Would you like me to keep going, sir?
Yeah, I don't see, though, we have anywhere where we know what he told them to tell them in this transcript. Do you?
I know from viewing the video that some of the male voices are Sergeant Langley.
Right.
But that's what we have as far as what he told them.
Okay. I guess I'm just trying to ascertain if you are aware of what Sergeant Langley's instructions were to the person who went down to tell the individual in 502 what to do.
The only instruction that it says is that to give them instructions over the phone is what he instructed.
Okay. Fair enough. Okay, you can close that. Thank you. Now, when the two people come out, they're ordered to the ground immediately.
Yes.
And that would be because it's a dangerous situation, fair enough?
Yes.
And that would be because this is a room where a rifle has been seen.
Yes.
And obviously it's because they're concerned that they might be armed with firearms.
Yes.
Now, at that point, the girl is given instructions, and she follows those instructions and is taken into custody.
Yes.
And then we turn to Daniel Schaefer. Correct?
Yes.
And he's told to put his hands in the air.
Yes.
And suspects are told to put their hands in the air for a very specific reason. One is to see that they have no weapons in their hands.
Correct.
And the second reason is to put their hands as far away from their body so they can't reach to places on their body where they might be concealing a weapon.
Yes.
He does that, but the next thing he does is he puts his hands behind him, doesn't he?
My recollection of the video, sir, is that he had started to give him instructions about how to come up on his knees, and that is, at some point there, he dropped his hands. The part where I recall him specifically telling to put his hands in the air was immediately after he put his hands behind his back. Because he told him to bring his hands out and put them in the air where they could see them. Something to that effect.
Okay, well, let's look at the transcript. And before we do that, one point I wanted to make. On page 14, Ms. Portil was frisked for weapons after she was taken into custody, correct?
I know that was the instruction that was heard on the videotape, so I would assume that occurred.
Okay.
But you can't see that on the video.
I understand. I didn't ask if you could see it. I just mean, it's said on the videotape, right?
Yes.
You're not clear yet. You haven't frisked her yet.
Correct.
Okay. Very good. Now, on page 15, it starts with the instructions concerning Mr. Shaver, correct?
Yes.
And then he is told, I said keep your legs crossed. Mr. Shaver says, I'm sorry, I just pushed my... Langley says, I didn't say this was a conversation. Put your hands up in the air, hands up in the air. Correct?
Yes.
He says, you do that again, we're shooting you, do you understand? What's happening right then?
Immediately before that, where he says, I didn't say this was a conversation, and then he begins to say, put your hands up in the air, was the point where Mr. Shaver put both of his hands behind his back.
Okay, so show us what's happening.
Sergeant Langley was instructing Mr. Shaver. Mr. Shaver was on his knees facing the officers.
Right.
Sergeant Langley began at the point where he says,
Put your hands up in the air.
at about the point where he's saying, I said to keep your legs crossed, and then Mr. Shaver says, I'm sorry, I just pushed my... And then that's when Sergeant Langley begins to say this is not a conversation and starts to say, put your hands in the air after he started to put his hands behind his back.
Well, he doesn't start to put his hands behind his back, he puts his hands behind his back.
That's correct.
Okay, you said that he starts to put his hands behind
I'm trying to explain.
Excuse me, I'm sorry, I can't, could they not talk
Fine.
over each other? I'm sorry.
Okay.
I can't understand.
Were you finished?
I was trying to explain that during Sergeant Langley's statements is when he starts to put his hands behind his back. That it was during that statement that motion began.
I'm sorry. Fair enough. But he does complete that motion.
Yes, he does.
Okay, fair enough. And after he completes the motion of putting his hands behind his back, then what?
Sergeant Langley then shouts at him to put his hands in the air, hands up in the air, to which Mr. Shaver complies. He puts his hands up in the air.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
And then at that point is when Sergeant Langley said, if you do that again, we're shooting you. Do you understand?
Okay, now, putting a suspect putting his hands behind his back is an incredibly serious act to a police officer, is it not, sir?
It can be, yes.
Isn't it always?
I've asked hundreds of people for their driver's license. They put their hands behind their back.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Fair enough. Poorly worded question on my part when I said, isn't it always? It depends on the circumstances, correct?
Yes.
Let me ask it a different way. For a suspect coming out of a room where you know he's just had a rifle, would you agree with me that a suspect putting his hands behind his back is always a serious movement?
Yes.
Okay. So this is the suspect who has just come out of a room where we know he has been pointing a rifle out of a window.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So it is legitimately fair for Sergeant Langley to be concerned that this person is putting his hand behind his back.
Yes.
And aren't you officers taught that oftentimes suspects... Wait a minute, let me withdraw that question. You know, suspects don't carry guns in holsters a lot of the times, do they?
No.
It's common for them to carry guns in the small of their back, right?
Yes.
And oftentimes, when they're reaching behind, they're checking to see if it's moved around or if it's fallen. They're checking on it, aren't they?
Sometimes, yes.
Okay, so it's reasonable for Sergeant Langley to have perceived that's what he was doing, right?
Yes.
Okay. In any event, he was certainly upset about that movement.
Yes.
And he told Mr. Schaefer, you do that again, we're shooting you, do you understand?
Yes.
All right. And then he said, Listen to my instruction. Mr. Schaefer said, okay, I'm trying to just do what you, so Langley said, don't talk, listen. Hands straight up in the air. Do not put your hands down for any reason. If you think you're going to fall on your face. If your hands go back into the small of your back or down, we are going to shoot you. Do you understand me? Mr. Schaefer said, yes, sir. Correct?
Yes.
Sergeant Langley said, crawl towards me, crawl towards me. Mr. Shaver said, yes, sir, please. Sergeant Langley said, don't. Next thing on the transcript is shots fired, correct?
Yes.
Would you agree with me that as the suspect came closer to the officers, if he had a weapon, he became a greater danger to the officers?
If he's moving closer and had a weapon, yes.
Would you agree with me that as you saw Shaver's movement, and I don't mean in slow motion as you viewed it, but as you saw it in real time, as you saw his as you saw his right arm move backwards, that it was sudden?
Yes.
It was without warning.
Yes.
It was quickly and a constant movement.
Yes.
And it was to an area where suspects often have weapons or guns.
Yes.
Thank you. Now, you would agree with me that you were taught, and all Mesa police officers are taught, that a suspect is not allowed to get off the first shot before a police officer is to fire, right?
We don't have to wait for a first shot. No.
Right. You don't wait until you see what's in his hand before you have to shoot.
I don't know that I was trained that, no.
Can I have a minute, Your Honor?
You may.
So, Detective, you told us this morning that you interviewed Mitch Brailsford, Officer Brailsford,
Yes.
that evening after you and he had viewed the acts on video, correct?
Yes.
You have before you Exhibit 9? Is that, or what is it? Exhibit what?
Exhibit 9, yes.
And that is a transcript of the interview?
Yes, it is.
On the second page, line 84, 81, or wherever, you ask him, as far as the man with the gun, were there comments on the call? You're asking him about the call that came in to him. He was riding alone,
Yes.
and so how would he have gotten the call? Do you know, sir?
Typically what would happen is there would be a hot tone, which are some audible beeps that come on the radio that there's an emergency call coming in. And then at that point they will dispatch officers who then turn to a different channel where emergency traffic is handled. He would have answered up that he was going to go to the call, and then he would have gone to that channel to receive comments and information as the call's dispatched.
Okay. So he knew when he came to this call that it was a man with a gun.
Yes.
And turning to page 6, you go through the whole thing with him, but in page 6, he's saying that this didn't work, and then the next attempts, verbal commands, he says those didn't work, is trying to get the people out of the room.
Yes.
That's his impressions, correct?
Yes.
And then page 7 at the bottom, tell us what he told you about the phone call. He's outside, the officers are outside a little down the hall. Tell us what he told you about the phone call, how he perceived the phone call to the room when they called the room.
He said, we then heard the phone ringing from inside the room. It rang several times. They didn't answer the first time, and so Officer Cochran, Canine Officer Cochran, called again, finally answered, but I could hear what was being said I couldn't hear what was being said on the phone. I then heard the phone. I don't know if it was slammed, but it was really loud, not like normal way someone would set the phone down.
All right, and then the next page, the female and the male came out of the room at the same time. They came out fast. They were given commands. And then he tells you how the female was taken into custody. And then on, let's turn to page 9. We get to how he's telling you about what happened. He says to Gomez, then, she's clear. Langley says, no, you need to frisk her. Let us know if there's any weapons. So he does. And then after that's done, we move to the male. And he starts providing instructions to the male the same exact way he did to the female. Places his hands down in front of him, flat on the ground, to push himself up to the kneeling position. The male does. Then he says the male does, but uncrosses his legs. And Langley tells him to cross his legs again. And then he says, he places the...
I'm going to object. Is there a question, or are you just going to read the transcript into the record?
A little of both.
He's not allowed to testify, so he's going to ask questions or
all right.
not.
So then he... all right, then I can have him read it. All right. He then says, or does he then say, I couldn't tell if he was manipulating something or if he was reaching for a weapon at this point?
Yes.
And so then the sergeant, does he say that Sergeant Langley yells at him to get his hands where we could see them?
Yes.
Okay, and then what does he say next?
So the male does it, places his hands up. He informs the male that don't place your hands behind your back. If you do that again, we're going to take that as a threat. You need to listen to our instructions. Would you like me to continue?
Yeah, go ahead. Read the next lines.
And so then he tells the male to start crawling towards us. So the male uses his hands and his knees and starts crawling towards us, doing like little baby, baby steps with his hands. A couple of steps in, the male pauses and then quickly reaches behind his back from my angle. The first time he reached behind his back, he wasn't as close to us. This time he definitely was. It seemed like he was right there, right in front of us. And just the way he reached, it wasn't like he was taking another step to crawl towards us. It was he slid one hand, his left hand out, and then like turned to the side and reached back with his right hand to where I couldn't see it. So that's when I assessed the threat. I fired my weapon 5 times, and I stopped shooting at the threat once I was able to determine that there was no longer a threat at this point. It was really, it happened so fast, it was like the blink of an eye. It's just a scary situation because, I mean, as close as you can see.
Don't go so fast. Does he say it was just a scary situation because, I mean, as you can see in this hallway, it's very narrow. The male was very, very close to us where he could have easily and quickly drawn a weapon down on us and fired without aiming, and he could have hit us or the citizen that we had just detained. Is that what he said?
Yes.
And then did he say, I mean, it was myself on the right side next to room 504?
Did I object again, Your Honor, that the defense is just reading this from the transcript instead of asking some questions?
I'll allow it.
And then did he say, I mean, it was myself on the right side next to room 504? There was Brian Elmore, Sergeant Langley standing behind me, so he's, you know, his head's right there, and Officer Doan's over there, and there's the citizen, I don't know where the citizen, and Officer Gomez and the K-9, and Unit Officer Cochran was, but it's just a very tight corridor. No covering, bullets would zip right through these walls. I don't think these walls would stop bullets. Is that what he told you that night?
Yes.
Okay. That's all I have, Detective. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Merritt. Ms. Charbel, any redirect?
Yes.
Whenever you're ready.
All right. Detective Syke. So even after defense counsel showed you the interview with the guests that were at the spa, there was nothing in there where they said that the rifle was pointed at them, correct?
Correct.
All right, and you told him earlier at the end of the morning that you had actually reviewed the actual interview and not just relied on what the other officers wrote in their report, correct?
Correct.
And in listening to them, they did not ever say that the rifle was pointing at them, right?
Correct.
Okay. Also, with regards to Ms. Portillo, she did not say that Daniel was being dangerous. She said they, meaning Daniel and the other individual, Luis, they were being what she called dangerous, correct?
Yes.
Now, that room 502, does it have a screen on the window?
Yes, it does.
So it's really not possible to stick a rifle all the way out that window, is it?
Correct.
All right, so you couldn't really stick it all the way out so that the barrel is past the window and pointing at a person or people.
Right, and I didn't take the comments to mean that when I read the comments on the call and listened to the dispatch, I didn't take it to mean that the rifle was actually stuck out the window,
Okay.
as much as it was being pointed out the window.
All right. So because it wasn't possible to stick it further out the window, right? The barrel would have just reached the screen and that would have been it.
I know there was a screen on the window, and I know they couldn't remove it at the scene. I didn't specifically try, but there was a screen there.
All right. And Ms. Portillo, she did not call 911 to report that she was in danger or that she felt scared or anything, right?
No.
As a matter of fact, when she was in the room with Mr. Shaver, they could be heard kind of laughing by the other officers, correct?
I don't know if they could hear it. I could hear it on the video.
On the tape, right?
Yes.
So even from a machine that's, audio recording from quite a distance, about a good 6 feet away, you could hear that they were laughing.
It seemed like, yes.
Okay. So she was not feeling any sort of danger. She didn't come out and say, help, this guy is holding me hostage, or I'm scared of him, correct?
Correct.
Okay. When defense counsel asked you if you had watched, and rightly so, you said you did watch the video in slow motion when you were writing your report, correct?
Correct.
You didn't watch it slow motion at the scene, right?
No, that was not possible.
Okay. The people downstairs at the front desk, they knew Mr. Shaver, correct?
Yes.
He had been there numerous times to stay at the hotel for work, right?
I know they knew him from the night before, and I believe he had stayed
There before?
but I know that they knew him because they'd spoken with him the night before.
Okay, and they had actually told the sergeant that he appeared to have been a bit intoxicated, correct?
I know it was in one of the interviews that they had that they'd said that, but I don't know if they specifically said they told Langley that.
Okay, but when Sergeant Langley and the other officers showed up, the first thing they did is they did go talk to the individuals at the desk, correct?
Yes,
To find out who was staying in that room, how many people were in there, correct?
correct.
All right, and they were told there were 2 males and a female up there, correct?
Yes,
Mr. Sergeant Langley and the other officers, they never went after the other individual, correct? Mr. Luis? They didn't send somebody looking for him? They didn't send
No,
out
I don't
any
know that
feelers
they-
about where he was?
out of the room at that point.
Okay, all right. You talked a little bit with defense counsel about trainings that that officers have to go through. Is that correct?
Yes,
Okay. Did these particular officers with Sergeant Langley, do they receive a different kind of training? Do you know?
training is always updated, so obviously I can't say to what they were trained to as opposed to what I was trained to. I know that, for instance, handcuffing procedures since I went to the academy have changed, so the way I would handcuff somebody is not necessarily the way another officer might have been trained to do it.
Fair enough. Let me ask you that question differently. Is this particular group of officers, are they trained in a special way, just the 5 of them?
No,
So they're not a part of some kind of special team that responds to these type of situations, correct?
correct.
And when people are trained in the academy or further, are they trained to blindly follow whoever the sergeant is at the time?
No,
So are the officers expected to make their own decisions about whether they're going to fire a weapon, whether they're going to, the level of force they're going to use to some extent?
yes,
All right, so if the sergeant had screamed, everybody start shooting, were they required to fire?
no,
And didn't Mr. Brailsford, in fact, tell you during the interview that he made the decision to fire on his own?
yes, he did.
That Sergeant Langley was not the person who caused him to fire, or anything that Sergeant Langley had said or done caused him to go ahead and shoot.
Objections, the transcript says what he said, and I object to his paraphrasing.
Overruled, the witness may answer.
He had said, yes, that he had made that decision on his own regardless of what Sergeant Langley had said.
In the area where Mr. Shaver was shot, was there not a big window behind him at the end of that hallway?
Yes, there was.
Were there not buildings and vehicles and things of that nature past that point?
Yes,
When you were asked about the protocol, about how suspects are asked to approach, are there different ways to have a suspect approach when there's officers there ordering them to approach?
yes.
Could you give us one of those examples?
One example would be if it's what you perceive to be a threatening situation. You might have someone standing. You would have them reach behind their back and grab the top part of their T-shirt or shirt and lift it up so that you can see their waistband. You would then have them circle 360 degrees and stop so that they're facing away from you. You would then have them place their hands either above their head or out to their side and walk backwards towards your voice.
All right. So there's more than one way to have a suspect approach you, correct?
Yes.
All right. And in fact, if you had them standing there with their back turned towards you, if someone was to come out from another room, they would actually be a barrier. Is that correct? They could be?
Theoretically, yes.
All right. So they could be standing between you and the person who may jump out of the room, out of the blue, correct?
Yes.
Compared to having the person down on their knees, sitting up and laying down and put your arms out, put your arms back, etc.?
Yes.
Okay. If you don't mind showing us, if that's all right, Judge, if you could show us when Mr. Shaver first put his hands behind his back, what that looked like.
When he first put his hands behind his back, he was on his knees. He had his hands up like this, and he brought them back like this.
All right. Did he not, in fact, bend over at the waist?
There might have been a slight bend. I would have to review the video for that specific movement, but
So if a suspect was to have a weapon behind his back, would it make sense for him to bend down and use both of his hands to grab one weapon?
it's possible, but it didn't appear to me to be a weapon drawing motion.
What did it look like to you?
In my experience, what I usually see is when I'm giving someone a command and they're not comprehending the command, such as if I tell someone to put their hands on the car or put your hands on your head, and because for whatever reason they think you're going to handcuff them, so I call it the handcuffing move.
Is that what it looked like to you? That he
Yes.
was getting ready to be handcuffed?
Yes.
Are officers trained, and these officers are no exceptions, as everybody's trained, but are they trained to look at every situation with the totality of circumstances in mind?
Objection, he does not know how this officer was trained.
Overruled, I'll allow.
Would either of the rifles that were in that, would they have fit in someone's pocket?
No.
Would you have been able to fit them in like your waistband, in those kinds of shorts, those basketball shorts?
You could fit it in your waistband, but it would be clearly visible.
All right, so it would stick out from where the shorts were.
Yes.
When Mr. Shaver was crawling around on his knees, could you tell that his shorts were kind of starting to fall down a little bit?
Yes.
Okay. Is it possible, since we talked earlier about he was possibly reaching for a gun, was he possibly reaching to pull up those shorts that were falling off of him?
Objection, speculation.
Overruled, the witness may answer.
Yes.
All right. Did it not look, in fact, as if he was starting to grab them when he changed his mind, and that's when he was shot?
Yes, that's what I felt he was doing. When I observed his body in the hallway, that his shorts were below his knees or very close to below his knees, where when you're crawling forward,
Objection, improper redirect. I did not ask any questions about what happened after he was shot.
Well, it was non-responsive, so I'll disregard that portion of the answer.
So as he was crawling, did it look like his pants, because you watched it on the video, did it look like his shorts were starting to come down a little bit?
Objection, asked and answered.
Overruled, I'll allow.
yes.
All right. Now, right before Mr. Shaver was shot, as he was bringing his arm up, was his head still facing forward, like he was still looking down when he was reaching for his waistband?
He was looking at the ground.
All right, so he was not looking at any officers or staring at anybody, correct?
Correct.
And he still had the left hand down on the ground, correct?
Yes.
All right. And he was still in a crawling position. He did not start to stand up?
Correct.
Okay. Even in Mr. Brailsford's interview, he did use the words, well, it appeared as though he was saying that Mr. Shaver was compliant during some of this incident, correct?
Yes.
He would say, the suspect did put his hands up or did do this, did do that, correct?
Yes.
All right, so even according to him, Mr. Shaver would not have been entirely non-compliant.
I don't like necessarily, as I said before, the word non-compliant or compliant. Compliant suggests he did everything exactly as he was told.
Sure.
It appeared that his intent was to do everything that he was told, so he appeared to me that he was cooperative but confused.
Okay. And during the questions from defense counsel about what each officer had said, the officers, including Mr. Brailsford, used the word perceiving a threat. Is that correct?
Yes, a couple of them did.
All right, and that was kind of uniform, right? Perceived the threat, perceiving a threat, or I perceived it as a threat, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So then it is your testimony, based on what you said earlier and to defense counsel, that Mr. Shaver was compliant when he understood the instructions, correct? That's what you told him.
He was compliant when he understood.
When he understood the directions, not the instructions, when he understood the directions given by the sergeant, sorry.
Again, I think he primarily understood the directions, but he was confused, and sometimes confused by Sergeant Langley's instructions.
Okay.
And sometimes probably confused from alcohol.
All right. And Sergeant Langley did request the key to the key card to the room, or the key to get into the room, correct?
Yes.
All right. So would that tell you that the key was, getting into the room was an option that the sergeant was contemplating?
Yes.
All right. And again, Sergeant Langley was one of the other, six officers that were there. He was one of the other, an officer who had a weapon that he could have used, correct?
Correct.
All right, and he chose not to use it.
Yes.
All right. And we're not sure if he even had his gun out, correct?
We do not know.
Even though this was a threatening type of situation, correct? That it came in as such.
I know that it's on the videotape. He's carrying an AR-15 also. However, in all of the portions of the video where you can actually see him, it's slung and not in his hands. Okay. So we do not know if he had a weapon in his hands.
All right. So even as, let's say, not every word that he's saying is being followed, right? Not every instruction. He still does not put out a weapon. He doesn't point the AR-15 anywhere towards Mr. Shaver, correct?
Well, objection. That is a misleading question because the officer said you can't tell. Don't know.
Well, the objection is that the question is misleading.
Yes.
The objection is overruled. If the witness finds the question to be confusing or misleading, you can let the prosecutor know and she'll rephrase it.
Oh, yeah.
Could you read the question back to me, please?
So even though he had the option after, let's say, Mr. Shaver wasn't exactly following the directions one by one, right, word for word, he still didn't point that AR-15 at Mr. Shaver.
I don't know if he did or not.
Okay. Well, but the times you could see him, he did not. He was not, anyway.
Correct. He's not visible on the videotape after they exit on the 5th floor until after the shooting occurs.
Okay. You were asked earlier, a defense counsel asked you if it was always a bad move to have a suspect with their hands behind their back. You said it depends on the circumstance. What is that? What do you mean? What did you mean by that?
I mean, as I said before, I've dealt with thousands of people in my career, and many times I'll ask them for their driver's license or their insurance, and sometimes that's carried in a wallet. So many times you see someone reach behind their back to get something like that. Anytime where I'm behind someone, I'm telling them to put their hands behind their back to handcuff them.
Okay. So, in the last words that Mr. Shaver said to Officer, or Sergeant Langley, I guess, since that's who was talking to him, was "yes, sir," and then "please" right before he was shot? I think it's in the transcript.
I would have to review to the transcript.
In front of you?
Yes, I do. No, it's on page 16. The last thing he says is "yes, sir," and then "please." And
that's when the shots were fired? Detective Seib, what is, have you heard the term sympathetic squeeze or sympathetic fire?
I usually hear it as sympathetic reflex
Okay.
or something along those lines, yes.
What does that mean?
It can mean any number of things. It can mean when you have, at least what I was instructed on, that if you have two people, one person hears a shot, they may sympathetically squeeze their trigger. It also refers to if you have two tools in your hand. If I have a taser and I have a gun and I mean to use the taser and I accidentally pull the trigger on the gun, it's kind of a sympathetic reflex where I'm trying to use one and I end up using both.
All right. And that happens sometimes, as you said, in your first instance, when someone fires and you're standing around and you're in that same kind of position, view, etc., that it makes sense that you would fire as well, correct?
Yes.
All right. That didn't happen in this case because nobody else fired. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Mr. Brailsford, during his interview, said that there were a million things racing through his head as this was happening. Is that correct?
Yes.
All right, so he was thinking there was nothing wrong with his thought process, correct? He didn't say he had a blackout or he doesn't remember anything that happened or any of that nature, correct?
That's correct.
All right. He said he was assessing the threat, right?
Yes.
And then he said that it happened so fast, like in the blink of an eye. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And he also told you that his sight, his eyes, right, were focused on Mr. Schaefer's hand. Is that correct?
Yes.
So he would have seen the movement and then made the decision to shoot after the movement happened as he's watching the hand, correct?
Yes.
All right. He also then told you that he was afraid for the female because she might have been in the line of fire of Mr. Schaefer, correct?
Yes.
Does that make sense for these 6 officers to have the female detainee sitting near them and close enough to them to get shot?
I think in that situation, when they're bringing them back and securing them, that is probably the most reasonable place. They wouldn't take them all the way downstairs or completely out of that area. So that seems to be a reasonable place.
Okay. Okay, just one moment, Judge. Oh, and I think we might have touched on this earlier, but Mr. Brailsford was not at the scene when you arrived, correct?
Correct.
Do you know how much time had elapsed from the time of the shooting until you were able to speak to him?
I do not know. I think my interview began a little bit after midnight, so 2 to 3 hours at the outside, I would guess.
Okay. And
it might have even been a little after midnight.
All right. And you don't know what time he left the scene?
No, I don't. He was not there when I arrived.
Okay. And so you don't know what was going on with him during that time period or the other officers, because you certainly didn't interview the other officers, right?
Correct.
Okay. Officer Cochran is the one who made the phone call to the room, correct?
Yes.
All right. And he didn't say anything in his, did he say anything in his report about the having to call twice? I couldn't remember seeing that, but it's in exhibit number 5. Is that in there?
It does say that he called a second time.
All right. And in fact, it says that when he asked the subject if his name was Daniel Shaver, and Daniel said, yes, sir. Is that correct?
Yes.
And he asked if there was a woman in his room, and he said that there was, correct?
Yes.
All right. So he didn't ask if there was another man in the room, right?
That's correct.
So by then, then the understanding was that it was just the 2 of them, correct?
I don't know if they thought that there were 3 people and he just failed to mention that he asked that. But according to his report, he only asked if there was a female.
All right. And so if they thought there was another man in the room, would it have made sense to ask about that person too?
It would.
All right. And so they did believe that part of the conversation, right?
Yes.
Right. So there was not really much of an expectation of a third person necessarily being in the room. Otherwise, they would have asked about him earlier. Does that make sense?
I understand that portion. However, I don't know if he just, when he was writing the report, if he failed to mention, I asked if there was a guy in the room also. or what the reason for that would be, because I didn't hear
Right.
his conversation.
But in his report, he says, is there a female in the room? He doesn't say how many people are there, or are there two people besides yourself? He just said, is there a woman in the room?
Correct.
Okay, thank you. That's all I have to.
Thank you, Mr. Charbel. May the witness be excused.
I would like to ask him some questions on the issue of the Brailsford interview on that issue.
On the issue of your client's interview,
Yes.
Something that wasn't covered previously?
Well, in that it was mischaracterized.
Your request for recross is denied. May the witness be excused.
Oh, yes, Your Honor.
Thank you, sir. You may be excused. Counsel, why don't we take 5 minutes?